They thought I was just an old woman who'd lost her usefulness. My own son and his wife pushed me literally through a glass door, blood on the snow, their voices calling it an accident. They didn't know I once ran million-dollar deals. They didn't know I had quietly built a fortune, $21 million, while raising him, paying off his debts and keeping the roof over his head. They believed I was broke, dependent, disposable. But the truth, I had been watching, planning, and waiting. What happened next wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming everything they tried to take from me. This isn't just a story about broken glass. It's about the silence that follows, and how I turned that silence into power. Stay with me, because what they never saw coming was that I was never the victim. I was the storm. The snow had begun its quiet descent before dawn, each flake drifting slowly past the kitchen window, like a memory falling from some place far away. Eleanor Hart stood at the counter, hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone lukewarm, staring into the white beyond. At 71, mornings had a certain stillness to them, sometimes peaceful, sometimes heavy. Today, the silence felt different. It wasn't the kind that comforted. It pressed against her chest. The radiator clanked faintly in the corner, struggling against the January cold. Upstairs, she could hear the muffled thud of footsteps, her son Daniel moving from room to room, the sound brisk, purposeful. She used to know every rhythm of his life, the way he hummed under his breath before big exams, the way his sneakers scuffed the floor when he was worried. Now, his steps told her nothing. They were just distant. Eleanor's life had been built around him from the moment she first held his small red face against her chest. Widowed when Daniel was just 8, she'd buried her grief beneath work and duty. The hospital where she'd been a rising administrator offered her more hours, more responsibility. She took them all, not for ambition, but for survival. She traded promotions for flexibility, turned down travel so she could attend every school event, forfeited the life she might have had so that his could be steady. When Daniel married Victoria, Eleanor welcomed her with the kind of open heart she wished she had received when she herself had entered a family. She helped them secure their first mortgage, even dipping into her retirement savings to make up the down payment. When their second child was born, she moved in temporarily to help with midnight feedings and laundry that never seemed to end. That temporary arrangement had quietly stretched into years. Her own dreams, small as they were, had been postponed indefinitely. She had once imagined traveling to coastal towns, maybe taking a pottery class, perhaps even writing a memoir of her years in the hospital system. But between Daniel's work struggles, Victoria's frequent illnesses, and the children's needs, there was always another reason to stay, to help, to give just a little bit more. Eleanor sipped her tea, now cold enough to taste faintly metallic. She thought about the necklace tucked in the back of her dresser, a modest gold chain Daniel had given her for Mother's Day a decade ago. "For all you've done," he'd said then, his smile easy, his arm draped around her shoulders. She'd believed those words. She'd believed that sacrifice in the end would be met with gratitude. But lately, something in the air of the house had shifted. Conversations shortened, doors closed more quickly. Victoria's voice, once warm with shared kitchen gossip, had cooled into clipped questions and polite nods. The laughter of the grandchildren reached her less often, muffled behind the glow of their tablets. The snow outside thickened, covering the driveway, the hedges, the world beyond. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the hallway where a framed photo still hung. Daniel at 12, grinning on the front lawn, a sandwich in hand she had packed that morning, his hair a mess, his eyes bright. She remembered the feel of his small arm looped around her shoulder in that moment. He had needed her then, in a way that was pure and uncomplicated. Upstairs, a door closed with a soft click. Eleanor set her cup down. She moved slowly to the sink, rinsing the mug, drying it, placing it in the cupboard with practiced care. That was the thing about sacrifice. Done right, it became invisible. People didn't see what it cost you. They only saw that it was done. The clock on the wall ticked toward 9. Eleanor adjusted the collar of her sweater, feeling the familiar ache in her knees. The doctor had advised rest, maybe even surgery, but she had brushed it off. There was always something more pressing, a school bill, a home repair, an extra grocery run. Her body had become another thing she gave without thought, just as she had given her time, her money, her voice. She had built this life brick by brick out of love and obligation. Every mortgage payment, every car repair, every whispered reassurance during Daniel's darker years had been part of it. And yet, as the snow fell and the house grew quieter, she couldn't shake the sense that somewhere along the way, she had vanished from her own story. In the kitchen, she touched the edge of the counter, grounding herself in the present. The air was cool, the scent of coffee lingering from a pot she hadn't brewed. A day like any other, except for the weight in her chest that told her something was coming. She didn't know what yet, but the signs were there, the same way the sky darkens before a storm. She took one last look out the window. The snow had smoothed the yard into a perfect white sheet, unbroken, untouched. For a moment, she imagined stepping outside, leaving the first footprints, claiming some small piece of the day for herself. But instead, she turned back to the sink, folded the dish towel, and waited for the next sound from upstairs. Sacrifice had taught her patience. It had also taught her that storms rarely announce themselves until they're already breaking overhead. The scent of frying eggs and buttered toast filled the kitchen, warm and comforting to anyone who didn't know the undercurrent running beneath the morning. Eleanor stood at the stove, spatula in hand, turning each egg with practiced precision. Her movements were automatic now, years of preparing meals for a household that no longer felt like her own. She glanced toward the dining table, already set with plates and silverware, and felt that quiet pang again. In her heart, she couldn't escape the truth. She had become the unpaid housekeeper, the silent caretaker, the woman who kept everything running while blending into the wallpaper. No paycheck, no thanks, not even acknowledgement, just expectation. As the toast popped, her mind drifted, unbidden, back to another kitchen, decades earlier. She'd been wearing a tailored navy suit then, not a worn cardigan. Her office at the hospital had overlooked the courtyard garden. Back then, she was Mrs. Hart, executive director, the one people came to for solutions, the woman whose signature could change policies. She remembered the pride in her staff's eyes, the respect in their voices. And yet, when Daniel needed her, when his father's sudden death left him small and bewildered, Eleanor had stepped down from it all without hesitation. The title, the salary, the influence. She had folded them away like last season's clothes and placed them in storage. She told herself she could always go back, but life has a way of filling the spaces you think you've saved. She never returned. A faint murmur from the living room pulled her from the memory. She turned off the stove, plates in hand, and moved quietly toward the sound. Daniel's voice, low, hurried, slipped around the corner. "We just need to make sure the deed's signed before the next quarter," he said. Victoria's reply was sharper, almost a whisper. "She's dragging her feet. If she signs it now, we can handle the refinance without the tax penalty." Eleanor stopped in the doorway, her breath caught mid-inhale. She stood very still, straining to catch more, but the voices lowered. A moment later, the scrape of a chair signaled the end of their conversation. She stepped back quickly, returning to the kitchen before they could see her listening. Her mind raced, but she forced herself to breathe evenly. Maybe they're just talking about taxes, she told herself. Paperwork. It's probably nothing sinister. She had learned long ago how to tamp down panic before it could take root. Still, the unease stayed with her as the morning wore on. A few days later, while sorting through the mail at the counter, Eleanor noticed something odd. The envelopes seemed fewer. A month ago, she'd received regular statements from the bank and her Medicare provider. Now, nothing for weeks. She asked Daniel if he'd seen any of her letters. He barely looked up from his phone. Probably mixed in with the junk, he said. That evening, she searched the drawer where she kept important documents. Her Medicare card was missing. The latest bank statement, gone. The small folder where she kept receipts had been moved, the edges of the papers not aligned the way she left them. The signs were subtle, but they lined up too neatly to ignore. A prickling at the back of her neck told her this was no accident. Someone was controlling what she saw and what she didn't. The following morning, Victoria came into the kitchen, dressed immaculately for someone staying home. Her heels clicked against the tile. She leaned against the counter, arms folded, her eyes scanning Eleanor like she was an item on a to-do list. "We've been thinking," Victoria began, "it might be simpler if the house was in our names. Less confusion with the utilities, the taxes. You wouldn't have to worry about any of that." Eleanor set down the teacup she'd been holding. "It's worked fine as it is," she replied, keeping her tone even. Victoria's smile was thin. "I know change can be uncomfortable, but this would make things easier for everyone. All it takes is your signature." The implication hung in the air, sweetened words wrapping around a demand. Eleanor held her gaze for a long moment before answering. "I'll think about it," she said, though she already knew her answer. As Victoria left the kitchen, the smell of her perfume lingered, a sharp floral note that somehow made the room feel colder. Eleanor stood alone again, the hum of the refrigerator loud in the silence. The peace she'd tried to preserve felt like it was cracking, one hairline fracture at a time. The snow had been falling since dawn, the kind of steady, muffled weather that made the world seem deceptively calm. Eleanor sat at the edge of the dining table, her hands folded loosely in her lap, listening as Daniel and Victoria moved about the kitchen. She knew something was coming, could feel it in the clipped tone of their voices, the way they avoided meeting her eyes. Victoria placed a stack of papers on the table, the pen set neatly on top as though this were just another harmless errand. "It's all straightforward," Victoria said, her voice carrying that polished edge she used when speaking to strangers she wanted to impress. "Just the transfer of the deed. You'll still be living here, of course. Nothing changes except the paperwork." Eleanor looked at the papers but didn't reach for them. "Why the rush?" she asked quietly. Daniel's chair scraped against the floor as he sat across from her. "Because it's smarter to handle it now, Mom. We can avoid headaches later. Taxes, probate, all that nonsense. It's better for everyone, she thought, except me." She leaned back, folding her arms. "I'm not ready to sign anything." The air shifted. Victoria's smile vanished like a switch had been flipped. "Eleanor," she began, using her first name instead of Mom, "you're making this harder than it needs to be. We're just trying to help you." Eleanor held her ground. "Helping me doesn't mean taking my name off my own home." Silence stretched between them, taut and brittle. Daniel rubbed his jaw, eyes narrowing slightly. "You've been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe you need some time away. Rest. We could handle things here while you take a little break." The suggestion carried the weight of a decision already made. Eleanor's pulse quickened. "I'm fine where I am," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Victoria glanced toward the back door. "Fresh air might clear your head," she said, rising from her chair. She moved behind Eleanor, her hand coming to rest lightly on her shoulder. It wasn't gentle for long. The next moments blurred into a sequence Eleanor would replay in her mind over and over. Daniel moved to her side, his hand brushing hers like he meant to guide her. Then, in one sudden motion, she felt a sharp pressure against her back, Victoria's hand, Daniel's arm, and her body lurched forward. The sound of glass shattering was louder than she expected, a dry, splintering crack that echoed in her ears. Cold air rushed in as she stumbled outside, her body colliding with snow and jagged shards. For a split second, she couldn't breathe. The sting of the wind mixed with the searing pain in her hands, where the glass had sliced through skin. The metallic tang of blood filled her mouth. Inside, Victoria's voice rang out, high and urgent. "It was an accident. She slipped." Daniel didn't say a word. Eleanor tried to push herself upright, but the snow was deep enough to catch her knees, and the glass cut into her palms again as she steadied herself. Through the open door, she saw them standing just inside, their figures framed by the broken outline of the door. Neither of them moved to help her. She rose slowly, the cold soaking through her coat, her shoes heavy with snow. The driveway stretched out before her like an escape route. She didn't look back. Every step away from that house felt like she was shedding something. Fear, disbelief, the last traces of denial. By the time she reached the street, the pain in her hands had dulled into a throb, but inside, something sharper had taken root. They had done it deliberately. She didn't need to hear them admit it. She could feel the truth in the silence that followed, in the way they closed the door behind her without a second glance. The snow kept falling, quiet and relentless, covering her footprints almost as fast as she made them. Victoria's voice cut through the stillness like a blade wrapped in velvet. "Eleanor, we're only thinking about your comfort," she said. Her tone dipped in false warmth. "Wouldn't it be easier if Daniel and I handled the heavy responsibilities? You've done so much already." Eleanor looked at her, the pen lying untouched between them. "Responsibilities," she repeated slowly. "You mean my house, my name." Victoria's smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened. "Call it whatever you like. We just don't want things to get messy later on." Daniel shifted in his seat, staring at a faint scratch on the table instead of meeting his mother's eyes. Eleanor felt that small betrayal like a needle under the skin, subtle but deep. "Daniel," she said, searching for some trace of the boy she'd raised, "is this what you want too?" He hesitated only a second. "Vic's right, Mom. It's the smart thing to do. We're a team here." His voice lacked conviction, but the decision was already in place. A heavy silence fell over the kitchen. Snow tapped softly against the window. Eleanor's heartbeat grew louder in her ears. Victoria pushed her chair back and walked toward the back door. "Come on," she said lightly. "Fresh air will help clear your head." Eleanor didn't move. "I'm fine right here." Daniel stood, walking toward her with measured steps. "Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be." His hand brushed her shoulder in a gesture that should have been reassuring, but it felt like a grip tightening around her options. Then it happened. Fast, but in her memory, it would replay in slow motion. Victoria's hand pressed into her back, Daniel's arm guided her forward, and Eleanor felt her balance tip into nothing. The world tilted. The glass door was suddenly inches from her face. Then, crack! The sound was sharp, brittle, final. Shards exploded outward, catching the pale light as they scattered into the snow. Cold air rushed in like a slap. Eleanor's body hit the frozen ground with a force that stole her breath. For a moment, all she could hear was the hiss of snow settling over the fragments and the faint hum in her ears. She opened her eyes to see the glass glinting crimson where her blood had fallen. The winter white around her was no longer pure. It was marred, streaked with warmth that didn't belong there. Her palms screamed in pain, thin lines of red already freezing in the wind. She turned her head just enough to see them still inside, framed by the jagged outline of the shattered door. "She lost her balance," Daniel's voice called out, flat and matter-of-fact. "Accidents happen," Victoria added, each word as precise as the way she stepped back from the broken glass. From the corner of her vision, Eleanor caught movement, Mrs. Kendall from 2 houses down, her face pale in the glow of her porch light. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. Mrs. Kendall hesitated, opened her mouth, then closed it again. She turned away, retreating inside. The message was clear. "I saw, but I will not say." Eleanor stayed on the ground for a few breaths longer, the snow seeping into her coat, the cold numbing the ache in her bones. The sky above was a heavy gray, the kind that promised more snow before nightfall. Finally, she pushed herself upright, glass crunching under her hands as she rose. The cuts stung, but the pain was sharp enough to steady her. She didn't look at Daniel or Victoria. She didn't give them the satisfaction of words. Without a sound, she stepped off the porch, her feet sinking into the snow with each deliberate step. Past the driveway, past the streetlight, into the kind of silence that was heavier than any storm. Behind her, the shards in the doorway caught the last light of day, winking like tiny, dangerous stars. She did not look back. The snow crunched beneath Eleanor's boots as she walked, each step pulling her farther from the home that no longer felt like hers. Her breath came in small, visible bursts, the cold air biting at her cheeks. She didn't know exactly where she was going, only that she needed to be anywhere but there. 3 blocks away, the neighborhood lights gave way to the dim stretch of a side road. A neon sign flickered weakly in the distance, Maplewood Motel. Vacancy. She approached the lobby, a small outdated space that smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning chemicals. The clerk, a young man with dark circles under his eyes, barely glanced up from the TV as she slid her driver's license across the counter. "One night?" he asked without interest. "3," she replied. Her voice was steady, surprising even herself. Room key in hand, she climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. The room was small, a bed with stiff sheets, a single lamp, and a view of the snow-covered parking lot. She dropped her bag onto the bed, sat down, and exhaled for the first time since the glass had shattered. The sting in her palms reminded her of reality. She went to the bathroom, rinsed the cuts under cool water, watching the pink swirl down the drain. Her reflection in the mirror looked older than she remembered, not because of the wrinkles or the gray, but because of the stillness in her eyes. She sat on the bed, her coat still on, and pulled out a small notebook from her bag. Years ago, she had started keeping casual notes, things she'd overheard, moments that felt off. At first, it was nothing more than habit from her days as a hospital administrator, where details could mean the difference between order and chaos. But over the past few months, the entries had taken on a sharper tone. Mail missing again, December 2nd. Victoria asked about my will. Casual tone, not casual question. Daniel offered to handle the utility bills, insisted on login details. She turned the pages slowly, her mind piecing together the pattern she had been too tired to admit. Her phone vibrated. A text from Maya. They hadn't spoken in months, but Maya had always been one of the few people Eleanor trusted. A former compliance officer in the hospital network, Maya knew the art of gathering proof without making noise. "Need your help," Eleanor typed. "Private. Urgent." Within minutes, Maya called back. "What happened?" she asked. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before telling her everything. The push, the glass, the silence, Mrs. Kendall's glance. When Eleanor mentioned she had a feeling something like this might happen, Maya's tone sharpened. "Did you ever set up any kind of security at the house?" Eleanor's breath caught. Months ago, when Victoria had taken the children to her mother's for the weekend, she'd installed a small camera in the living room, hidden in a ceramic owl on the bookshelf. It was meant for peace of mind, nothing more. "I think it might have caught it," Eleanor said slowly. "Good," Maya replied. "Don't go back there, I'll take care of it." True to her word, less than 2 hours later, Maya sent a link to a secure drive. Eleanor clicked it, her hands trembling. The video loaded, grainy but clear enough. She saw herself at the kitchen table, Daniel beside her, Victoria across. She heard the muffled conversation, saw the moment Victoria stood, Daniel moved closer, and then the shove. The sound of the glass breaking was louder than she remembered. The image of herself disappearing into the snow made her stomach twist. She closed the laptop, pressing her palms to her eyes. It was one thing to live it, another to see it. The next morning, Eleanor walked down to the diner on the corner, a place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that was always too strong. She took the farthest booth, facing the door, and pulled out her notebook again. She wrote a single word at the top of a clean page: proof. Underneath, she listed what she had: video footage of the incident, personal notes documenting months of suspicious behavior, witness, Mrs. Kendall, physical injury, cuts and bruises, untreated. She tapped the pen against the page, thinking about the next step. She couldn't just store this and hope it would protect her. She needed someone who understood the legal weight of what she held. After breakfast, she returned to the motel and searched her contacts for Nadine Holloway, an attorney she had met years ago through a hospital board connection. Nadine was known for two things: absolute discretion and a talent for building airtight cases. When Nadine picked up, her voice was exactly as Eleanor remembered: low, steady, with a hint of gravel. "Eleanor, it's been a long time." "I need your help," Eleanor said simply. By that evening, they had arranged to meet at Nadine's office the next morning. Eleanor gathered everything into a single folder: the printed deed to her house, the video footage on a USB, her notebook, and a copy of her living will. She placed the folder on the nightstand, turned off the lamp, and lay back in the darkness. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling the world into silence. For the first time in years, Eleanor wasn't afraid of that silence. She was ready to use it. The motel room was quiet in the kind of way that pressed in on you, a silence thick enough to make every creak of the radiator sound like a voice in the dark. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, her hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm tea from the vending machine in the hallway. The curtains were half closed, letting in a dull gray light from the snow-covered parking lot below. Loneliness sat heavy in the room, but it wasn't the kind that made her ache. It was the kind that sharpened her thinking. Here, away from Daniel's averted eyes and Victoria's clipped tone, she could line up every piece of the puzzle without interruption. Her phone buzzed once. A secure link from Maya had arrived. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she opened her laptop, the cold metal biting into her palms. There it was. Footage pulled from the small ceramic owl she had placed months ago on the bookshelf. A quiet insurance policy she never thought she'd cash in. The video began like any other family conversation. Victoria at the counter, arms crossed, Daniel standing too close to the doorway. But then Eleanor saw it. The subtle shift in Daniel's stance, the way Victoria's voice sharpened even though the volume stayed low. The shove came without warning. Glass shattered in a sharp, almost crystalline sound, followed by a burst of white as snow swallowed the frame. She sat frozen, staring at herself in that moment, her hands raised in surprise, the recoil of her body, the way the cold took her instantly. Pain twisted through her chest, not just from remembering the impact, but from the icy realization that they hadn't rushed to help. They had watched. She played the video again, but this time her eyes caught something different. A moment from weeks earlier, recorded on the same hidden camera. Daniel, alone in the living room, crouched near the cabinet where she kept her old leather-bound savings ledger and the folder of insurance papers. He rifled through them quickly, glancing over his shoulder before tucking something into his jacket. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Eleanor closed the laptop with deliberate care. This wasn't just betrayal. This was premeditation. She reached for her folder, the one she had organized the night before. Into it, she slipped the USB drive containing both clips. The weight of it felt different now. Heavier, more dangerous, more necessary. It was time. She dialed Nadine's number. The lawyer answered on the second ring, her voice calm and grounded. "Eleanor, tell me everything." Eleanor laid it out piece by piece. The shove, the glass, the snow, the footage, the stolen documents. Nadine listened without interruption, only the faint scratching of her pen on paper in the background. When Eleanor finished, Nadine's voice was firm. We'll file for elder abuse, property coercion, and intentional concealment of evidence. The footage is strong. We'll use it. You have a case, Eleanor. A solid one. For a moment, Eleanor felt her breath return in full. It wasn't victory. Not yet. But it was the first real step toward reclaiming what had been taken. They agreed to meet in the morning at Nadine's office. Eleanor hung up and let her shoulders drop. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, blanketing the cars in the lot until they were nothing but soft mounds. Her gaze drifted to the corner of the room, where her old green notebook lay half open on the chair. She picked it up and thumbed through the pages until she found a worn photo tucked inside. Daniel, at about 12, sitting beside her on a patchy hospital lawn, eating the peanut butter sandwiches she used to pack for him. His hair was sticking up in every direction, his arm draped loosely around her shoulders. She remembered the warmth of that afternoon, the way he'd laughed with his mouth full, the way he'd leaned into her without hesitation. Back then, there had been no Victoria, no whispered conversations in the kitchen, no eyes that looked through her instead of at her. The ache in her chest shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a reminder that even the deepest betrayals are built on foundations that once held love. Eleanor slid the photo back into the notebook and placed it carefully in her bag. Tomorrow would begin the legal fight. Tonight, she would let the snow fall, let the motel hum with its old pipes and thin walls, and let herself remember just enough to know why she was doing this. The next morning, Eleanor woke before the motel alarm clock could buzz its tired chime. The air was still cold, the faint hum of the heater mixing with the quiet drip of melting snow outside. She sat up slowly, her body reminding her of every bruise and ache, but her mind felt sharper than it had in years. She poured herself a cup of coffee from the small machine in the corner and stood at the window. The snow had stopped overnight, leaving the world covered in an untouched white that reflected the first rays of sunrise. For the first time since the glass had shattered beneath her, Eleanor felt something break open inside. Not fear, not bitterness, but clarity. She thought about all the years she had lived, as though her worth depended on how quietly she could bear things. She had told herself that keeping peace was more important than speaking up, that sacrifice was a form of love. But looking at the snow now, she realized silence had only given others room to rewrite her story, without her consent. She turned to the desk and opened her leather folder. Inside were the deeds, the savings statements, the insurance records she still controlled. Every page told the story of decades spent building security for herself and for Daniel. Security he had decided he was entitled to take. That would end now. Eleanor took out a blank pad of paper and began to write. The first page was a simple list. Secure legal counsel. Meeting with Nadine today. Transfer critical assets into protective trusts. Establish a safe, permanent residence under her own name only. Decide what comes next, not just in court, but in life. She underlined the last point twice. By the time the coffee had cooled, Eleanor had added a fifth item. Build something lasting that no one could take from her. The thought of it stirred something deep in her chest. Her phone buzzed with a reminder for her appointment. She dressed in the same wool coat she had worn to every major milestone in her career before she'd left it all to raise Daniel. The coat still carried the weight of boardrooms and negotiations, but now it would witness something even more important, her reclaiming of herself. The drive into town was slow, the roads were still slick from last night's snow. Eleanor used the time to rehearse in her mind the words she would not back down from. I will not be coerced. I will not be erased. At Nadine's office, the warmth of the reception area contrasted sharply with the icy air outside. Nadine greeted her with a firm handshake, her eyes steady, her desk already cleared for business. Eleanor, she said, motioning her to sit, we're going to make sure you're protected before anything else. For the next hour, they went over the paperwork, discussing legal options for asset protection. Nadine explained the benefits of a revocable trust, how it could shield her property from any further attempts by Daniel or Victoria to gain access. She outlined the steps to freeze certain accounts, to flag property titles, to ensure every important document was duplicated and stored safely. Eleanor listened carefully, asking questions when she needed to, making notes in her precise, slanted handwriting. She realized she was no longer just reacting to what had been done to her. She was shaping what would come next. When they were finished, Nadine looked her in the eye. "You've spent a lifetime giving. This is about keeping, not just your assets, but your voice." Eleanor left the office feeling taller somehow, as if each step toward the car added an inch to her spine. She stopped at a small stationery shop on the way back to the motel and bought a leather-bound planner. It wasn't just for legal notes, it would be for her plans, her vision, her future. That evening, she sat at the small motel desk and began to map out her next months. Court dates and legal steps filled one page. Ideas for a community initiative filled another. The thought of helping women who had been overlooked, silenced, or manipulated gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She closed the planner and leaned back, letting the hum of the heater fill the room. She was no longer the woman who left her son's house with blood on her sleeve and no plan. She was Eleanor Hart, and she was done being quiet. That night, in the muted quiet of the motel room, Eleanor pulled her old green cloth notebook from the bottom of her bag. The edges were frayed, the spine loose from years of use. She had kept it for decades, jotting down moments that, at the time, seemed small but had carried a sting, the kind of sting that stayed. At the top of the first page, she had once written, almost as a joke, "Times I was overlooked." She began flipping through the pages. There were entries from 20 years ago. Daniel forgetting to call on her birthday. Victoria making offhand remarks about her being out of touch. Others were sharper. The time her son suggested she sell the house because it's too much for you now. Or when Victoria intercepted her mail claiming it was for convenience. Halfway through the book, something new caught her eye. An entry from only 3 months ago, scrawled hastily, "Unfamiliar withdrawal. Forward me $200. Joint account from Dad's old insurance." She remembered questioning the bank about it and being told it was authorized online. She had assumed it was a mistake in record keeping. But now, in light of everything, the name on the transaction burned in her mind. Victoria's. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to take a breath. This wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was a paper trail. The next morning, Eleanor arranged to meet Marcus, an old colleague from her hospital administration days. Marcus had always been discreet, the kind of man who could untangle financial knots without drawing attention. They met at a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a tailor shop. When Marcus saw her, he smiled warmly, but his eyes immediately went to the faint bruise still shadowing her wrist. "You don't have to explain," he said gently. "Just tell me what you want to do." Over steaming mugs of coffee, Eleanor laid it all out. The incident at the house, the hidden mail, the mysterious withdrawal, and her plan to secure every asset before Daniel or Victoria could touch it. Marcus listened without interrupting, taking careful notes. "We can restructure," he said finally. "Move the funds into layered accounts. They won't be able to reach them without a court order, and even then it would take years. We'll also look into creating something in your name only. Something lasting." For the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt the tightness in her chest loosen. She nodded. "I want to build something they can't take, not just for me, but for others." That evening, back in the motel, she let herself think about the dinners she used to host. The big oak table in the dining room, the smell of rosemary chicken, Daniel laughing with his mouth full, Victoria pretending to help with dishes but more interested in her phone. Those nights had faded slowly into quiet meals, alone at one end of the table, the air thick with unspoken tension. She turned from those memories before they could sink her too deeply. Instead, she opened her laptop and began drafting the outline for something she had only hinted at with Marcus. The Montreux Fund. It would be a nonprofit trust dedicated to women over 60 who found themselves abandoned, discarded, or overlooked by the families they had once sacrificed for. It would provide legal resources, financial counseling, housing assistance, and, most importantly, a place where they would be heard. Eleanor chose the name carefully. Montreux was an old family word from her grandmother's side, meaning to rise again in a dialect long forgotten by most. She worked late into the night, sketching out the structure, listing potential partners, even drafting a mission statement. For every woman who gave everything and was left with nothing, we will stand with you until you stand again. When she finally closed her laptop, the clock read 1:13 a.m. She was tired, but it was the kind of exhaustion that comes from building, not breaking. The next morning, she signed the first preliminary forms Marcus had sent over via secure courier. In a few weeks, the Montreux Fund would exist officially. It wouldn't just be a shield for her, it would be a lighthouse for others. Standing at the motel window, watching fresh snow fall over the quiet street, Eleanor made herself a promise. She would never again walk through the doorway of that old house. The home she had once built with love had been turned into a place of calculation and betrayal. That chapter was closed. The future, she decided, would belong entirely to her. Eleanor had always believed that the most powerful changes in life happened quietly. There were no parades, no grand announcements, just small, deliberate steps taken without the need for anyone else's approval. Weeks after leaving the old house behind, she had settled into a rhythm in her modest apartment, overlooking a frozen lake. The mornings began with tea brewed in the same porcelain pot she'd had for 20 years. The afternoons were filled with meetings, discreet ones in tucked-away cafes or private offices, where she worked with Marcus and a small legal team to finalize the Montreux Fund. By the third month, the paperwork was done. The foundation had its own bank account, an initial $5 million endowment from her personal investments, and a skeleton staff who didn't know her as Daniel's mother or the widow Hart, but simply as Ms. Eleanor Hart, founder. She liked it that way. It was on a gray Tuesday that she received the invitation that would set the next turn in motion. It came in a heavy cream envelope embossed with gold lettering. Hawthorne Properties invites you to an exclusive showcase of our latest luxury renovation project. Eleanor almost tossed it aside, but the address caught her eye. The development had been funded in part by a private investment group she had quietly joined months earlier. Through a series of strategic moves, she'd become a silent partner in several real estate ventures. This property was one of them. 2 days later, she arrived at the location, a minimalist 5-bedroom home on the outskirts of the city. The air was crisp, the driveway lined with freshly trimmed hedges. From the outside, the house looked like something out of a design magazine. Inside, agents in tailored suits moved between clusters of potential buyers, offering champagne and rehearsed smiles. Eleanor walked slowly, letting her gaze travel over the high ceilings, the imported tile, the staged furniture. She was halfway through the tour when she heard a voice she hadn't expected to hear again. Victoria. Her tone was as polished as the marble countertop she stood beside. She was explaining the unique blend of modern architecture and rustic charm to a young couple, gesturing toward the open-plan kitchen. She wore a fitted black blazer, her hair pulled into the kind of sleek bun Eleanor remembered from countless family dinners where she'd sat silently while Victoria steered the conversation. For a moment, Eleanor stayed back, hidden among the crowd. She watched the way Victoria smiled, all surface, no warmth, and the way she positioned herself between the buyers and the space, as though she owned it. Then Victoria turned her head, and their eyes met. It was only for a second, but Eleanor saw the flicker, the flash of recognition, the quick calculation behind her daughter-in-law's gaze. Victoria recovered quickly, offering a polite nod, as though Eleanor were just another guest. but her shoulders had tightened. Eleanor didn't approach her right away. Instead, she moved toward the sunroom at the back of the house, where the winter light streamed in through tall windows. She ran her fingers along the windowsill, feeling the smooth finish. Behind her, footsteps approached. It wasn't Victoria, but a young assistant with a clipboard. "I'm sorry, ma'am. This section is for private viewing only." Eleanor smiled faintly and handed her a business card. Simple, understated, with only her name and the title, Strategic Partner, Montrose Capital Group. The assistant's eyes widened as she read it. "Oh, I'll let Ms. Brooks know you're here." Minutes later, Victoria appeared in the doorway. She didn't step into the sunroom. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said, her voice smooth but her eyes darting briefly to the card in Eleanor's hand. "I'm sure you didn't," Eleanor replied evenly, "but I suppose we have mutual interests now." There was a beat of silence, the kind that fills a room like smoke. "You're involved in this project?" Victoria asked finally. "In more ways than you realize," Eleanor said. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The implication was enough. Victoria's jaw tightened. She glanced toward the main hall where the young couple was now speaking to another agent. "This is a professional setting," she said, her tone dropping lower. "I agree," Eleanor replied, stepping past her. "And in professional settings, one learns not to underestimate the people who sign the checks." She didn't look back as she walked toward the front door. The exchange had been brief, but it had landed exactly where she wanted it to. Not as a confrontation, but as a reminder. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner. She stood for a moment on the walkway, watching her breath cloud in front of her. It struck her that this was the first time she had seen Victoria since that night. The night of the glass door, the snow, the silence. And here they were now, both playing different games, but only one of them aware of all the rules. That evening, Eleanor sat in a quiet cafe downtown, a place with dark wood tables and low jazz humming in the background. She ordered black tea and opened her notebook, jotting down a single line. "They still think they're ahead." She closed the book and watched the snow begin to fall again outside the window. She didn't need to rush. The beauty of building something quietly was that no one saw it coming until it was already too late. In her new apartment, Eleanor found comfort in the rhythm of her days. The place wasn't large, but it was hers. Every piece of furniture chosen with intention, every book on the shelves a quiet companion. Mornings began with the same ritual. The whistling kettle, the slow pour of tea into a pale ceramic cup, the faint scent of bergamot filling the kitchen. After breakfast, she would take a short walk by the frozen lake, her boots crunching against the snow. The cold no longer bit at her the way it had in those first weeks after leaving Daniel's house. Now it felt bracing, almost cleansing, as if each breath of frosty air cleared away another layer of the past. She had thought this season of her life would be about retreat. Instead, it was becoming a kind of rebirth. That quiet transformation had been unfolding behind the scenes in ways no one, especially Victoria, could have predicted. Through a series of careful investments and share acquisitions, Eleanor had become a significant shareholder in Hawthorne Properties, the very company where Victoria now built her career. Her name was not on any public register connected to the firm. The shares were held through a private trust managed by Montrose Capital Group. It was a move made not for vengeance, but for leverage. She didn't intend to use it recklessly. Power, she had learned, was most effective when it didn't announce itself. Still, the shift in Victoria's demeanor when they crossed paths was unmistakable. On the surface, she remained polite, her tone clipped, her greetings formal. But her eyes betrayed something else, a tension, a wariness. The easy confidence she'd once wielded around Eleanor had faltered. Eleanor noticed it most at the second property showcase they both attended. Victoria spoke to her with the same rehearsed warmth she used for clients, but there was a flicker in her gaze, a calculation that hadn't been there before. It was as if she were trying to solve a problem she didn't have all the pieces for. That problem deepened when certain projects Victoria had championed came under sudden financial review. The audits weren't public scandals. Eleanor wasn't interested in destroying reputations, but they were enough to delay launches, freeze budgets, and force uncomfortable boardroom conversations. The beauty of her position was that she never had to be the one delivering the news. She simply set the dominoes in place and let gravity do the rest. Victoria, of course, had no proof, but Eleanor could sense that she suspected. There was a subtle shift in how Victoria moved through rooms when she was near. Less sure-footed, more guarded, as though every word might be overheard by the wrong person. One evening, as Eleanor sat at her desk reviewing foundation proposals, her laptop chimed with a new email. It was from Nadine. The subject line was simple: case update. Eleanor opened it slowly, scanning each line with deliberate care. Nadine's words were precise, professional. The depositions had gone well, the video evidence remained unchallenged, and the financial records they had submitted were airtight. The judge had indicated that the case had a strong chance of succeeding, both on the assault charges and the property coercion claims. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, letting the information settle. She had never been one for counting victories before they arrived, but this felt like standing on the crest of a hill and finally seeing the valley on the other side. It wasn't joy she felt, it was steadiness. She closed the laptop, slipped on her coat, and stepped outside. The snow had begun again, thin flakes drifting down like slow-falling ash. She walked without a destination, her boots tracing a quiet path along the lake's edge. The city lights glowed faintly in the distance, reflecting off the frozen water. Each step felt lighter, more certain. Months ago, she had left her son's house with nothing but the clothes on her back and a silent vow to herself. Now she was walking with the weight of something far greater. Not wealth or influence, but clarity. She realized then that she no longer needed anyone's acknowledgement to feel whole. She didn't need Daniel to apologize, or Victoria to fear her, or the world to know what she had endured. The strength she had now came from within, forged in the quiet spaces where no one had been watching. By the time she reached her building, the snow had thickened, dusting her hair and coat in white. She paused at the entrance, looking up at the dark winter sky. Somewhere out there, the people who had tried to break her were still moving through their days, unaware of just how much stronger she had become. And that, she thought with a faint smile, was exactly how she wanted it. The courtroom was smaller than Eleanor expected, a modest space with pale wood paneling and tall windows that let in the brittle light of a winter morning. There were no reporters, no crowd of onlookers, just the steady hum of the heating system and the rustle of papers being arranged on tables. Eleanor sat beside Nadine, her hands folded in her lap. She wore a navy suit and her late husband's watch, not as an ornament, but as a quiet reminder of the years she had spent holding others together. Across the aisle, Daniel avoided her gaze, his shoulders tense beneath a suit that hung slightly loose, as if he had lost weight. Victoria sat beside him, her face a mask of composure, though her clasped hands betrayed the tension in her fingers. The judge, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair pulled into a bun, began with a review of the charges. The words fell into the air like stones dropped into water. Elder abuse, coercion of property, obstruction of reporting. Each one seemed to echo longer than the last. Nadine rose, her voice even and deliberate. She presented the security footage first. On the monitor, the grainy black and white image showed Eleanor being approached by Daniel and Victoria near the glass door. There was no audio, but the body language told the story. Victoria's sharp gesture toward the door, Daniel stepping in close, the sudden movement and Eleanor's body hitting the glass before disappearing from the frame. The next seconds were frozen in stillness, as if the room itself were holding its breath. The judge watched without comment, but her pen moved across the notepad in front of her. When the video ended, Nadine handed over the supporting evidence, medical records, photographs of the injury, and the chain of custody proving the footage's authenticity. Then came the financial records. Page after page documented how Daniel and Victoria had attempted to gain control over Eleanor's property. The intercepted mail, the hidden bank statements, the unexplained login attempts on her accounts. Nadine laid it out, not with outrage, but with precision, letting the facts do the work. Daniel's attorney countered with a narrative of misunderstanding, a family argument taken out of context, an accident fueled by stress and miscommunication. He painted Eleanor as an aging woman prone to overreacting, perhaps misremembering events. But the video, unyielding, undeniable, undercut every word. When the judge finally spoke, her tone was clear and measured. She ruled in Eleanor's favor, granting a permanent protective order against Daniel and Victoria. They were stripped of any legal claim to her assets, barred from contacting her directly or indirectly, and ordered to undergo counseling for abusive behavior toward vulnerable adults. The court also froze their ability to access or transfer shared accounts, ensuring that the financial damage they had hoped to inflict was now impossible. Eleanor didn't smile. This wasn't triumph, it was closure. She simply nodded once, her eyes steady on the judge, then gathered her things and followed Nadine out into the crisp air. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily down, settling on the courthouse steps. Eleanor paused for a moment, drawing in the cold air, feeling its clarity. There was no applause, no fanfare, just the quiet knowledge that she had protected what was hers, and in doing so, drawn a line that would not be crossed again. Back at her apartment, she placed the court documents in the fireproof safe alongside the other records she had kept since the night of the incident. The safe wasn't just for protection anymore. It was a testament to her refusal to be erased. The Montreux Initiative was thriving. What had begun as an idea scribbled in the margins of a notebook had grown into a living, breathing organization. The small office now hummed with activity, volunteers sorting supplies, advisors meeting with women over cups of coffee, the sound of printers churning out grant applications. Eleanor moved through the space quietly, not as a figurehead demanding recognition, but as a steady presence. She listened more than she spoke, asking questions, offering resources, and connecting women to opportunities they thought were beyond their reach. One afternoon, she attended a workshop for women starting second careers after 60. The room was filled with laughter, nervous energy, and the scratch of pens on paper. During a break, a woman named Janice approached her, tall, silver-haired, with eyes that held both weariness and determination. "I heard what you've done here," Janice said softly. "Not the details, just the kind of woman you must be to make this possible. Thank you." Eleanor smiled, accepting the words without deflecting them. She had learned that sometimes the quietest acknowledgments meant the most. By the end of the year, the Montreux Initiative had helped over 200 women secure housing, find employment, or access retraining programs. The walls of the office began to fill with photographs, women standing proudly with new business licenses, holding keys to their first apartments in years, smiling with grandchildren they could now support. Eleanor never sought to put her own face among them. This wasn't about her image, it was about their futures. Still, in the privacy of her home, she kept one photo on her desk, a group shot from the initiative's first retreat, everyone laughing around a campfire under a blanket of stars. She remembered that night vividly, the air crisp, the fire warm, the feeling that something good had been set in motion. The legal victory had given her security, but the Montreux Initiative gave her purpose. And purpose, she realized, was the truest form of wealth. On a quiet evening in late December, Eleanor stood by her window, watching the city lights flicker against the snow. Somewhere out there, Daniel and Victoria were living with the consequences of their choices. She felt no need to know the details. What mattered was that they could no longer touch her life, She poured herself a cup of tea and sat at her desk, opening her journal to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote just one line. Justice isn't always loud, but when it's real, it doesn't need to be. Then she closed the book, turned off the light, and let the stillness of the room settle around her. The hearing hadn't been dramatic. No shouting matches, no pounding fists. But to Daniel and Victoria, each moment was like a slow, deliberate cut to the image they'd built for themselves. Every document presented, every piece of footage replayed, every line in the judge's decision carved away at the confidence they once wore so easily. By the time the gavel struck, they sat stiff and small, shadows of the people who once believed they could control her. A week later, a plain envelope arrived at Eleanor's apartment. The handwriting was uneven, hesitant, Daniel's. Inside was a short letter. He apologized, said he had been under pressure, that he didn't recognize himself anymore. He asked her to remember the boy he used to be. Eleanor read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer she rarely opened. Forgiveness was not a reflex anymore. Silence, she had learned, could speak more powerfully than any reply. On a rainy afternoon, she found herself staring out the window, the steam from her tea clouding the glass. Her mind drifted to birthdays spent together, to dinners where laughter felt real, to moments when she believed they would grow into better versions of themselves. Those memories were bittersweet now, like photographs faded at the edges. They belonged to a chapter that could never be rewritten. One morning, Nadine walked into the Montreux Initiative office holding a large, sealed envelope. "This just came in," she said, handing it over. Inside was a confirmation of a wire transfer, a significant sum, enough to fund new programs for years. The donor had chosen to remain anonymous, but Eleanor recognized the name on the routing bank. Someone she had helped long ago, quietly, without expectation. A woman who had been on the edge of losing everything, and now, it seemed, wanted to pass the kindness forward. Eleanor felt the corners of her mouth lift into a rare, genuine smile. Weeks later, she drove out to the neighborhood she once called home. The air was crisp, the streets dusted with fresh snow. She parked across from the old house and watched. Through the front window, she saw a young family. 2 children chasing each other around a decorated tree, their parents laughing as they tried to keep up. The porch light glowed warm against the early dusk. It was the same house, but it was no longer hers, not in any way that mattered. And for the first time, she felt no pull, no ache to step inside. What she saw wasn't loss. It was proof that life moved forward, and so had she. That evening, she returned to the Montreux Initiative. In the conference room, a stack of legal papers waited on the table. She sat down, pen in hand, and began signing. Each signature transferred more of her holdings. Every bond, every trust, every carefully built investment into the foundation. By the time she set the pen down, the total was complete. $21 million, no longer hers alone, but dedicated to the women who needed it most. As she leaned back, a quiet stillness settled over her. The weight she had carried for years, of betrayal, of silence, of holding on too tightly, had shifted into something else entirely. She wasn't erasing her past. She was transforming it. Outside the window, snow began to fall again, thick and silent. Eleanor looked out, her eyes calm, her expression steady. She knew the women this money would help. She knew their faces, their stories, their determination. And she knew that every cent was an investment in resilience, the same kind she had found within herself. Somewhere far away, Daniel and Victoria would hear about this, perhaps from a news article or in passing conversation. They would realize that what they tried to take had instead multiplied, placed beyond their reach, forever. But Eleanor wasn't thinking about them now. Her thoughts were on the women who would walk through the Montreux doors in the months to come, carrying their own bruised histories, searching for a foothold. She would be there. Not as their savior, but as a quiet reminder that survival could lead to something greater. As the last page slid across the table and her pen left its final mark, Eleanor exhaled slowly. The room felt warmer, though no one had touched the thermostat. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and steady, as if sealing this moment in white. And for the first time in decades, she felt utterly, unshakably free.